So today we're going to work with graduated colors. I'm going to show you how to blend one color into a lighter, less saturated version and blending one color into another color. Right now I'm mixing up my puddles of paint. I'm adding about 3 to 4 drops of water to the sap green. Sap green is one of the colors we'll use today. And then I'll add 3 to 4 drops of water to burnt sienna, and that will be our brown. And then I'm going to add 3 to 4 drops of water to yellow ochre. So the 3 mixes we'll use today are sap green. That's what I'm putting on the paint palette right now. I'm trying to create a large puddle of paint. So when you're working with washes, you want to make sure you create a large puddle of paint to pull from, so you won't have to keep remixing that puddle. And now I'm creating a large puddle of saturated yellow ochre. I've created 2 puddles because if I mix some of the sap green into the yellow ochre, then I have a third color, a yellow green, which I'll use for the gradient. And then to the far left, I'm going to have a yellow green, but it will have more of the mix of green in it. And lastly, I will create a puddle of the burnt sienna. So I'm starting with my, I'm going to create that. I have 3 rectangles. The middle rectangle I'm going to fill with a light wash of the yellow ochre, because once that dries, later I will use it to blend sap green into burnt sienna. And now I'm mixing up my burnt sienna puddle. Okay, so to the right and the left of the yellow ochre swatch, I'm adding a little bit of water at the top of the rectangle. By doing so, I'll be painting wet on wet, and that will give that soft, blended appearance. And I do clean my brushes. So as you see, I dip the brush in the water. I quickly dry it with a paper towel that's in my hand, and then I'll just pick up more pigment or more water. So what you'll see me do throughout this demo is slowly add a little bit of water to the edge of the saturated block of sap green and burnt sienna. And as I slowly add pigment and water, I'll work to get that gradient to move from saturated to less saturated. And keep in mind, I started both of these swatches, the one on the left and on the right, is wet on wet. And if you do this wet on wet, it's going to be easier to blend and control your gradient. As you can see, it takes time to really get the gradient the way you want it. It will probably dry lighter than it appears, so you'll see that I'll go in and continue to add more pigment as we go down toward the bottom of the rectangle. And you can see sometimes I will pick up some pigment if too much pigment is getting to the bottom of the wet area. I'll just pick up the pigment, and that will allow that field to just soften. You could see where it's challenging to try to control the gradient over a larger field. It's just a matter of adding more water and letting the color trickle down. I thought it would be nice to just add a little bit more saturation to the top of the burnt umber field. I'm just going in with little dabs just to add a little bit more saturation. I'm using a round brush. You can also experiment with a flat brush. As you can see for the demo, I have 3 cups of water at the top of the image area, and I keep my water pretty clean. If you want your colors to remain clean, then you want to keep your water clean. So I have a water that I'm using just for the green and a water that I'm using for the burnt sienna, and then an extra cup of water with clean water. Now I thought it would be interesting to add a little bit of the yellow green, a little bit of the yellow ochre and yellow green mix to the green gradient. I'm actually creating these swatches to get a good idea of how I'm going to approach painting the oak leaves in the upper left-hand corner. So I like to work from life, and I found these wonderful oak leaves on one of my hikes, and I thought that would be a great botanical illustration challenge. So before I even start to paint, I will end up sketching the oak leaves in, but before I even start to paint those, I'm creating these swatches and experimenting with how I can control my gradient. So now with the center rectangle, I'm going to work on a gradient that moves from burnt sienna to sap green. So I'm starting with a highly saturated burnt sienna, and then I will soften the gradient, and then that will move into the sap green. So that's one nice thing about experimenting with graduated fields. You can try to move from one color into another. And the way you control your gradient is I've been going back and forth between adding pigment, which is more highly saturated brush stroke of pigment from the well, or adding water, and when I add water it's going to thin everything out. It will get lighter and less saturated. So once I'm happy with my gradients at the top, I will at the end go in and mix up a mixture of the sap green, the yellow ochre, and then I'll put some of that burnt sienna in there. And that's what I'm doing right now because I'm trying to figure out how I will handle the dry leaves, the dryness of the oak leaves. So that's what I'm doing at this point. I'm adding some burnt sienna and experimenting with the different values that I can get with the mixture of all 3 paint colors: sap green, yellow ochre, and burnt sienna.